One of the things that I get asked so often is how to decide whether you're planning an indoor event or an outdoor event or maybe a combination of both. So this is the episode for you if you're on the fence about whether or not to have any part of your event outside. We are going to talk about all the tips and tricks and things you need to consider when planning an outdoor event.
You mean we're going to talk about the W word? We make all these new words. Weather.
Well, that's not a new word.
No, but new for our podcast.
Or Mother Nature.
Well, you can...
Don't mess with her.
MN. We're shortening it MN. All right. Where do we start, Sharon?
I think one of the first things you need to consider when you're trying to make the decision, I have a lot of clients that love the outdoors and they want to be outside, but some things you really need to think through, simple things like, will the ground support chairs? Where will your guests go to the restroom? It's really cool right now and really popular to get married, on a farm or maybe a family member's property. But you have to consider, if you're having 200 people at your house, do you want 200 people going in using the restroom? If not, what's the plan?
Well, how about before the event ever starts, parking?
Parking is huge, and you have to make sure that they can park where they're not going to get stuck.
Well, you said the ground supporting the chairs. I've heard people that have planned outdoor events at family members' properties, and it's a great property to have your event. There's no parking.
Yeah. That's a big consideration to think of because, for one thing, you're going to tear up your yard. But when it comes to having your wedding too, and you always have to have a plan B for the weather. And I always say make plan B just as important as plan A. Because what's going to happen is, say the bride and the groom, mom, dad, whatever, they're busy getting their everything done, taking care of each other. And then it comes down to Sharon, for example.
A wedding planner to make
the decision.
Mm-hmm.
That wedding planner does not want to run to the bride and her mom and say, okay, what do you all want to do here?
Or it needs to be discussed ahead of time. Do you want to have a conversation? Who's involved in that conversation? Because it affects so many other logistics.
Does. Well, and if you talk about that up front, then that bride or that mom does not get upset that the wedding planner has made that decision to go with plan B. Because sometimes when you pick the plan B, or if you go to the bride and say, hey, we've got weather problems, what do you want to do? Well, then that upsets her. But if you have the conversation up front, hey, if it rains, this is plan B. We're going to go for it, and we're not going to ask you. We're just going to do it.
You mean to tell me that the wedding planner cannot control Mother Nature? I mean, the wedding planner. The wedding planner,
she
Mike.
Would if she could.
The wedding planner is supposed to take care of everything, Mike. You mean they can't have a discussion with Mother Nature? In all honesty,
I'll tell you what. I know Sharon tries her best to have a conversation with Mother Nature, but
in our area here, we're Louisville, Kentucky, Southern Indiana. I don't know about other places, but you can look at the weather map and you can look at the percentages on your phone. That doesn't mean it's not going to rain.
I think
we know that for an example,
yes.
For sure.
I think the smartest, fairest way that I have found to deal with it is in your planning meetings prior to the event, ask the question, who do you want, like Mike just said, who do you want to be responsible for the final weather call? I usually do not want to be the only person making that call. And the reason is it's not my money being spent. So when clients have spent a lot of money and they have a vision in their head for what they want their event to look like, I don't want to be the only person making that call. I also don't want that person to be the bride or the groom. So
unless they're adamant about being part of that conversation, correct. Right?
So like this past weekend, we did an event, Mike and I did an event together, and both parents were involved in the call. And, here's to Mother Nature with myself and both parents making the call together, looking at radars, seeing absolutely no rain in the
You mean you were an actual meteorologist as well as a wedding planner?
Yes.
Interesting.
absolutely.
She's a damn good one too. let me tell
Gosh,
you.
I didn't really. I mean, I knew she wear a lot of hats, but meteorologist.
Absolutely no rain on the radar in the state of Kentucky. We made the wrong call. So that being said, that's why that plan B is so important. Like if a ceremony's outside, when I run rehearsal, we're going to rehearse it outside. We're going to rehearse in our normal spot. Then we're going to truck it over to wherever plan B is, and we're going to rehearse in that ceremony site for plan B. So that way, if I do have to move an event, the bridal party is familiar with that space. They know where they're supposed to go in both spaces. Because you don't want to throw it on a bridal party with adrenaline pumping an hour before a wedding and say, oops, now we're going to do it over here. And they don't know their marks and they don't know where to go. So it's really important that plan B be just as important as plan A and that you practice both.
Well, and some of the other things too to think about is the decisions affect catering, possibly the cake, your dancing.
They affect every vendor on your
everything.
team.
And
Yeah.
I'm sure you have them breathing down your neck. You have to have some kind of plan in place. And I've even heard people with a plan C, honestly.
I mean, if you think about it, you've got DJs with thousands of dollars worth of equipment outside. You've got your caterer. Maybe she's got, a prep oven or he has, a portable kitchen outside.
Or if they're doing
florist,
plated.
yeah.
If you're doing plated.
Your florist has, thousands of dollars worth of decor out there. So yeah, it affects the whole team. And sometimes it's a daunting thing to have to make that call.
Well, let me say an example that happened about 4 years ago, and this bride was lovely. Her name was Portia. I'll never forget her name. You'll never forget that name anyway. But we had a plan A, plan B, and at the last minute, we decided to go to plan B. This is a learning thing for me. She was getting married at Whitehall, and as you know, Whitehall is an old historical home, has this beautiful staircase in it, and they also have these beautiful gardens. We actually had flowers going around the arches and everything in the gardens, and here it comes this storm. So we moved everything in on the staircase. Now, that took me a couple hours to do. Pouring down rain the whole time I did it. The sun came out. She said, Mike, do you mind? Let's go ahead and move it back out to the garden. Wasn't my favorite thing, but, like
Team
Sharon
bride.
always says, it's team bride.
Right.
So we moved it all back outside. It wasn't even 10 minutes after I got it done. Storm came, sky opened up, poured down rain the rest of the night. They never, ever saw those flowers. And she spent a good couple $1,000 on these flowers just for the wedding for her to walk through or walk down a flight of stairs. And they were never in any pictures or anything because I moved them back out to the garden and they were never, they didn't take place there. So it's so important when you make your decision, it's plan A or plan B. Don't ever go back just because. I mean, if it's something that you're just going to pick up and go out and get married, that's one thing.
Not your whole setup.
But if you have to change your whole setup and you've spent thousands of dollars on flowers and then you lose them like that, it's crazy.
As the planner, like once I make the call, whether I'm right or I'm wrong, that's the call. We can't yo-yo the whole vendor team around.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I was thinking of is depending on your setup, you're probably going to have some kind of transition team. If you're talking elaborate setups and you get all of it set up one time and then you go to plan B, having a plan, who's helping transition that? Because if you don't have your florist there the entire event or your rental company, you could be talking tables, chairs, florals, decor. The list goes on and on.
Well,
so somebody's got to help you move that stuff.
Something that I've learned the hard way is when I do an outdoor event, I always have an extra assistant. And that's because you don't know what's going to happen. I've also experienced florists, DJs. Well, you'll see more people on wedding day if an event's outside. But I also, I'll be honest, I've even asked guests, if it should start to rain, could you do this? And could you do that? And could you do this? So that when I feel that first raindrop, I just say go. and we all know what we're doing. And that's what happened this past weekend. It actually went really seamlessly when it did start to rain.
Well, and I know there's some people that just really want to have their ceremony outside. And probably a ceremony, depending on your decor and everything. Now, you may have to move chairs and stuff, but that could be maybe a little bit easier transitioning to plan B, depending again on your setup. But your whole reception, tables, the table decor, if you're doing plated, you could be talking about a lot of pieces just with one table.
It is a lot of pieces. But that's why you plan accordingly, and you put that in the line up and let the wedding planner. And if you don't have a wedding planner, that's one reason why you should have a good wedding planner. So you are not the one that's making the decision, such as it being the bride or the bride's parents or whatever. Hire somebody to make that decision for you.
So Sharon, when you first started this off, you were talking about things to consider, and obviously restrooms. A lot of times out there now you're seeing restroom trailers and not just porta pots. They're actual trailers with lighting, and you have a whole experience that we won't necessarily have to talk about on this with trailers, but
Nowadays, you can rent restroom trailers that are honestly nicer than most home restrooms. They're air conditioned, they're clean, they're not
most of the time they work.
to not be gross. They're not smelly if they're working correctly. You just want to make sure you use a reputable company.
I want to keep going with this, because if you have an event where it's over a couple of days where you're doing rehearsal, ceremony, reception and things, you've touched on this before about making sure with their contract, do they come and clean them?
So this is probably TMI, but what you want to do is you want to tell that company how many guests you have and how many days that trailer is going to be in use, because they know how big, it's called the black water tank, I've learned a lot, is on those trailers. And they know how the average of how much that tank is going to fill up for that amount of people. For each person, they know how much to allow. So I always ask that a representative from that company be on call for me. And that number's in my cell phone. So
not the office number.
No.
An after hours number.
Like this past weekend, not only is it a weekend, it was a holiday weekend. So I want the cell phone number of the person on call, and I want to know their response time. So if I do start to see that I have a problem, I can call and get them out there before any guest knows that there's a problem. But honestly, if you're very upfront about your guest count and the amount of days they're going to need to be there, then you rent the proper size trailer to accommodate your guest count and your crowd. You also need to make sure that you have a water hookup for that trailer. You can't just park it in the field. It has to have a water hookup, and it has to have electricity. So those are some things that you have to consider when you're renting a restroom trailer. And honestly, it's such a nice thing to have unless it goes bad. Then it's horrible. So you want to make sure that you know what you're doing, or that you hire a company that will guide you through it.
Well, and I know in our area now with the porta pot companies, a lot of times they have the hand washing stations that are really nice that you can have. One of the things too that I've heard about this before with someone is making sure that they're handicap accessible, because sometimes your restroom trailers aren't necessarily handicap accessible, but there are porta pots that you can do that are handicap accessible. So thinking about all your guests. And that brings me into another thing. I know we mentioned parking, and one of the best things, when Josh and I got married on my parents' property, one of the things that we wanted to make sure was we had people help with parking, because we had a certain size field that could be used, but we needed to make sure that it was done in rows, because if not, people tend to park in all different ways. So I don't know if you've seen that a lot with outdoor.
I have, and you also want to make sure, just to go back on it because it's so important, say it rained 3 days before your wedding, what's the backup parking plan? Because people are going to get stuck in that field. And I think another thing to really, being considerate of your guests that you want to think through in an outdoor event is, especially for older people, how far are they going to have to go from where they park to where the ceremony is? And don't let that keep you from having your event. There are ways around it, but it needs to be considered. If you feel like it's too big a distance, or maybe the ground's not even, or it's bumpy, then the answer I think, is a golf cart. Actually very inexpensive to rent.
Mm-hmm.
You can rent a golf cart, and you can actually have someone drive the guest to where they need to be, so that you don't have to worry about someone falling, or maybe a grandparent not being able to see the ceremony because they can't get to the space.
Or if you have scheduled a valet service.
Yes.
Especially when you're in that time of that grounds, that big of a ground that you park your car, if you're in the grass or whatever, you have somebody valet it, then they can be dropped off at the front of the reception, barn, house, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. My grandparents were older at that time, and we made sure that we had 6 or 8 very close places that they could park, because they weren't going to stay the whole time either. So them being able to be closer and then be able to have easier access to leave. And it's so interesting, because that was one of the things that one of my grandpas had mentioned, was the chairs. Most of the time when you rent chairs from companies, they're not necessarily the sturdiest of chairs for older people. And if you've got a table that they're going to lean on and your ground is not completely smooth, it's not the easiest for them to get up and down. Looking back on that time when I danced with my grandpa, he made sure to remind me, those chairs and getting up off that table, it's a little tough out here in the grass. Okay, Papa, but thank you for being here. But it is something to consider, especially.
You can also rent a floor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can. And there's other things. Going back on it, somebody had mentioned we could have done like a mat, just to have where the older people, those are important people that you want part of your day.
And you want them comfortable.
Yes, you can't control necessarily the heat, but obviously tent, things like that, and setting them close to a fan, are some things. So it's really important about the ground, and parking and all that is so important with outdoor weddings. We haven't even gotten to the ceremony yet.
Well, I want to say too, we're pointing out all the negatives that could come up during a wedding with weather. But you have your percentage that a lot of the weddings at outdoors are perfect.
Or it rains earlier in the day, and then they end up with a beautiful
or it's beautiful
evening.
all week, or
Yes.
it maybe rained the week before. But these are things that you need to take into consideration just in case.
Well, we're seeing so many more outdoor weddings.
We are.
I don't know if what we've been through has kind of brought that more to light, but
over the
many different types.
Yeah, over the last 3 months, all of our outdoor weddings, almost every time, I hate to say it, but it's always rained, sprinkled, or something, and we've always had a plan B.
But don't let weather take down the happiness and the importance of that day in your life, because
Or determine what you want out of that day. Don't let the weather do that to you.
Can it cause some problems here or there? The whole reason we wanted to talk about this topic was so many people are embracing outdoor events. There's just some things to consider just a little bit further, or much more further than if it's an indoor
Outdoor
event.
events are absolutely gorgeous. They're so pretty. And I think, with what we've been through with the pandemic, I think people felt safer outside. So a lot of weddings got moved outside that maybe weren't originally planned to be outside. And I'm here for it. Like, I love it. I think they're so pretty. And I think you just have to have a solid plan B. I've talked a lot about the logistics, but from Mike's standpoint, I know decor and floral arrangements, there's some special things to consider. I've watched him do enough outdoor setups. What do we need to consider when we're outside that maybe isn't a worry inside?
Where do you start, Mike?
Oh my. Well, just for an example, this weekend, the setup we did. It did rain, but it wasn't a downpour where it canceled where we had to move it to the barn. or inside. But it depends on what product you have and what product you don't have. But that's why you always got to keep in the back of your mind what you're going to do, even though we had it already set up. Now this weekend it was I want to say it was beautiful because it was beautiful. Did it rain? It did rain, but being Memorial Day weekend, I'm going to say it's Memorial Day weekend. Normally that's when summer starts, and usually it's hotter than you know what. And it was
not.
40 degrees. It was 40
I'm telling
degrees.
you, I packed everything so that this sweet bride would not sweat in her wedding dress, because I was expecting 80, 90 degree weather. And in a wedding dress, they will soak themselves.
Well, the day before it was.
Yeah. And literally I was trying to keep her warm instead of having.
Everybody had coats on, but you know what? It went on like there was never
It
a
was
problem.
actually gorgeous because it was just overcast enough that the candles were able to be seen, and it was stunning. But I noticed, like on the arch that you had, it had to be weighted down.
I mean, there's lots of things. I mean, you never know what's going to happen with not if it just come a rain, but wind. Wind is a big thing. We did another wedding this past weekend, and we had a big pergola that we decorated. The wind was so strong, it was flipping and flapping the fabric. But I mean, again, that's something that you have to take into consideration. And also, when we're hanging product like that, you've got to have sandbags. You've got to have zip strips. You've got to zip strip everything down so it still looks professional and not messy. Because after the wind blows on it for 3 or 4 hours, you don't know what it's going to look like.
Right.
But I'll be honest with you, when we went back that night at 10 o'clock and picked it up, yeah, the wind wasn't blowing, but it still looked just as good as it did when we put it there. But you move all the fabric and you see all the sandbags we had and all the zip strips we had zip stripped on there, but nobody knew that.
Right.
But that's something that we have to take into consideration when setting things up outside.
And I know even when we do market lighting, you use zip ties, zip
Yes.
strips, whatever you
Yes.
call them. Yeah.
So the other thing too is sometimes you have more decor and rental items in outdoor events that you have to be able to allow additional days for setup. So if that's not your own property, I'm assuming you would have to make arrangements to rent those places for additional days.
You do. So when you rent, your typical wedding venue, think of the things it's going to come with. It's going to come with lighting. It's going to come with electricity. It's going to come with a bathroom. It's going to come with tables. It's going to come with chairs, maybe
Heat and air.
linens, heat and air. All those things are still needed. So, not to toot wedding planners' horns or to try to sell wedding planning.
That's part of your
But
logistics. You're to help bring all those
that
pieces
is
together.
double for a bride to try to take on to pull off an event like that.
Because they haven't been through it before, so they don't know
Right.
what all to think about.
And to be honest, every time that I do, honestly, anytime I do any wedding, when Monday comes and you're kind of in wedding hangover mode, as I call it, you think back, what could I have done better or what could I have done different? And I learn something every single wedding. But these outdoor weddings, you learn a lot, and each time you take that with you. So,
Well, and sometimes brides think and families think that and not to the consideration of this past weekend, but sometimes they think it's a little bit less expensive to have it outside and
It's
pitch a
double.
tent. It's double.
I was going to say, I
than
was thinking
what
the other way.
At
what
least
you would
double.
normally.
yeah.
Because you're not just renting a building that may have, for example, the refinery we were talking about with Alex a few weeks ago, that they've got tables, they've got chairs, they've got all that. But if you have your reception outside, you have to rent a tent, you have to rent the tables, you have to rent the chairs, you have to rent the linens, you have to rent everything. So you're actually building a structure to have your wedding in.
I think that's why we're seeing venues, especially that offer an outdoor space to have the ceremony, but then an indoor space to have the reception. I really feel like people are really wanting to have these outdoor ceremonies, that they tend to look at that as an opportunity. Right, there's my plan B. If I can't have it outside, I can move it in. So if that's something that's really close to your heart, you may want to review all options before you decide to have it on your own property or a family or friend's property.
Yeah.
All your options.
You need to sit down and make a list of everything you have to rent.
maybe you even need to start too thinking about your guest count, because if it's a huge guest count, there is a whole lot. We already mentioned parking, bathrooms, tables, tents. You could be talking about a whole lot of rental stuff.
Well, and a lot of times when people decide to do their wedding on a private property, it's because that property is extremely pretty. When we think of those type properties, they're not usually downtown.
Correct.
They're usually more rural. So
Further out.
logistically, you're looking at higher delivery fees because you're asking companies to come much farther than normal. You're also looking at if you forget something, and I'll throw myself under the bus. I shorted myself 2 tablecloths, the wedding that we did last weekend. And I was on site from, starting Wednesday. So I realized what I had done, but it's not like I could just hop in the car and run to the rental company and grab these tablecloths because I was 2 hours away. So, then you're making those phone calls and facilitating getting what you need. So there's just a lot more thought process to it than what I think some people understand when they think, oh, this would be gorgeous. And you know what? They are gorgeous. You just have to know, you have to make an informed decision of what you're getting into.
I think this has been really enlightening for those people who are considering or tossing the idea around. As you said, they're beautiful. Don't let weather necessarily dictate, oh, well, gosh, we've got to go up against Mother Nature. It's just something that you have to keep in the back of your mind. And like you all said, plan B, maybe even a plan C. Just really put the thought ahead of time, not the week of the wedding.
Right.
Right, because we don't want this to be a negative at all. We love doing outdoor weddings, but just plan
And they're so
accordingly
pretty. They're so pretty.
to what you have to do and what you have to look forward to
and
or
make
not look
plan
forward
B
to.
as important as plan A. Practice them
That's
both.
the main thing right there.
Because some people be like, oh, well, this is my thought if it rains. But when that rain comes, they haven't really executed plan B, so they don't really know what's going to happen. And people don't know what to do.
Well, you need to definitely think about that ahead of time, because if you have any amount of guests, that is so many tables and chairs and centerpieces, and the list can go on and on. So I think this has been great. And I can't wait to see people that want to share your outdoor weddings, or if you've got planning with your upcoming event that's going to be outside. We'd love to hear from you. Anything else you all want to add? Nope. Okay. Well, thanks for tuning in. We can't wait to hear from you. Visit our website or catch us on social media. Until next time, see ya.
This episode of The Ring, the Bling, and All the Things was brought to you by The Wedding Experts, whose mission is to connect engaged couples easily and efficiently to local wedding experts. Visit theweddingexperts.love to connect with your local wedding vendors, as well as access valuable resources to help you plan all the details for your big day. If you are a wedding professional, there are affordable and effective advertising opportunities available to you by visiting theweddingexperts.love/advertise.